she's just had enough. And I think many people might understand that. There's life beyond politics.
So what's next? Does this hurt the mission for independence? And who will replace her? Well, John Boothman is the Sunday Times political correspondent in Scotland. A very good morning to you, John. How are you?
I'm splendid. How are you, Rosie?
I'm really well. Thank you for taking the time this morning. As I said, sort of the surprise of the announcement has sunken in a little bit, but the repercussions are vast. The first, I guess, immediate problem is that the SNP have got to sort of find and quickly get a replacement, but there isn't a clear successor, really, is there?
No, I mean, it's 20 years since the SNP had a leadership election, and, what happened when Nicola Sturgeon became really SNP leader and First Minister was that we knew for years, she'd been deputy for 8 years, that she was going to take over. This time it's very, very different. There is no succession in place. There's probably a handful of people that people think could potentially succeed in the role. The Sunday Times did some polling in that at the weekend and found that among the general population, not a single one of those possible contenders really had the support of a bit more than 7% of people. So it's a pretty sort of blank page open field for people. It's clear that Kate Forbes, 32-year-old finance minister, who's an interesting person, Gaelic speaker, brought up in the Highlands and then in India, a graduate of Cambridge University and Edinburgh University, who is somebody who's out there that, a lot of people, I think, are beating a path to her door. Angus Robertson, the former Westminster leader, who's possibly more well known outside Scotland. He's the External Affairs and Culture Minister in the Scottish Government, could make a run. He's been a Westminster MP and is now a Scottish MSP. Already there are suggestions that Ash Regan, the most prominent rebel, the only minister to have resigned during the tenure of the SNP government since 2007 over that controversial Gender Recognition Act, might be throwing her hat into the ring. And there's a few others as well.
How much of a problem is it for the party that they don't have a sort of recognisable second in command?
Well, I think it's already causing problems. Tonight, the SNP executive meets to discuss the timetable and arrangements for the contest. Officials are saying that could last 6 to 8 weeks. There's some doubt already that special conference due on March the 19th to discuss the future of independence will get cancelled. All those contenders, tiptoes at the moment, taking soundings, assessing their chances, putting together teams to organise campaigns. This was really such a big, big shock. Few people knew about it. Nobody's really ready and organised for a campaign. So, yes, a difficult time, certainly in the short term for the SNP.
And not necessarily for some politicians in Westminster. There are reports that the news was met with jubilation yesterday.
Well, I think, to be fair, Labour think that they can do well at a next general election. Nicola Sturgeon's been in office for 3,004 days. She's the longest serving First Minister. She's well known. Probably, to be fair, again, the best political communicator in the political stage, not just in Scotland, but across the UK for a number of years. So I think you would imagine that Labour would certainly be happy. They think they can make inroads into the SNP vote at the general election. The Tories have had a good run recently, to be fair. Again, they, on that gender recognition bill, have certainly pulled themselves back from very, very low poll ratings. So I think they could be happy. And that position really where we see that there is no successor, no designated successor, probably in the short term helps both of those parties.
What do you make of this analysis? One senior government source has reported, front page of the Times today, saying this is the best day since we won the referendum. It's a generational setback for independence and a generational boost for unionism.
I'm not so sure about that. The simple fact of the matter is in 2014, the referendum was won in a 55-45 margin, percent margin for the unionist side. Actually, when you look at the polls, the numbers are about the same. Now, one of the reasons I suspect, and I think she signalled this yesterday, that Nicola Sturgeon is gone, is she's realised that She was the person who could not take the SNP any further. On the constitutional issue, one of the big issues in Scottish politics, the constitution is stuck. And I think Nicola Sturgeon concluded she couldn't move that dial. I can understand that, as I say, short-term jubilation from government ministers. But the fact is, if you look at the priorities of people in Scotland, whenever they're asked at the moment, their priorities are the cost of living crisis, the NHS, the same priorities you would find across the whole of the UK. And that whole issue of the Constitution has really slipped down the agenda. And I think, as I say, Nicola Sturgeon realised that, and that contributed quite a lot to her going yesterday.
Why do you think she decided to go?
Well, look, I was talking to a number of her colleagues. I mean, I followed Nicola Sturgeon since she was 16 in politics. She comes from the next town along from where I live. She's been an incredible force. She joined the parliament when she was 29. When she was 37, she became a minister. She's 52 now. And you know what? One of her colleagues, in a very heartfelt conversation that I had with him, said, she's just had enough. And I think that many people might understand that. There's life beyond politics. I'm struck by a slightly bizarre headline in the pro-independence newspaper, The National, this morning. The first line reads, "I am a human being." And after all, yeah, independence is bigger than politicians themselves, Nicola Sturgeon said yesterday. And I think maybe she began to see, a number of her other colleagues have said, that maybe she became part of the problem rather than solution. And I think she alluded to that in her resignation statement yesterday.
Talking of front pages, the Daily Telegraph make it very clear Sturgeon brought down by trans row. Is that fair?
I think it played a part. Look, you know, this is something that we all thought was a bit strange to plant a flag on at the end of the day. I think it's also in recent times the case that the SNP beginning to start to lose its grip a bit, not quite catching the pulse of people in Scotland. If you look again at any of the polls, that whole idea of gender recognition, the problems it's caused, it's not a popular issue in Scotland. And as I said earlier, it's something that the Conservatives have taken a grip of. I mean, the most interesting comment, and this shows how far Nicola Sturgeon and her reputation goes, was from one Donald Trump last night. And listen to this. Donald Trump last night on social media said, "Good riddance to failed woke extremist Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland. This crazed leftist symbolises everything wrong with identity politics." And he then took a pop at her about that whole issue of gender recognition. Sturgeon thought it was okay to put a biological man in a women's prison, and as if that wasn't bad enough, she fought for legislation which would have allowed a 16-year-old child to change their gender without medical advice. So clearly Donald Trump thinks that that whole bill was a problem too.
Sadly for Donald Trump, he'll play no part in choosing who takes on the helm of the SNP next. John, thank you so much. I really appreciate your analysis. It's going to be a busy sort of few days ahead for you, I'm sure.
Yes, it is, but a lot of confusion in the SNP. We'll find out tonight what that timetable is, and I think that's the next step.
John, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. The Sunday Times is political correspondent in Scotland.